The wind in the Shoshone National Forest carries a specific kind of silence. It is a vast, high-altitude wilderness where the granite peaks of the Wind River Range keep watch over secrets buried beneath decades of pine needles and winter snow. In the summer of 1997, a world-class athlete named Amy Wroe Bechtel stepped into this landscape for a routine afternoon run. She never stepped out. When investigators finally pushed past the frantic search parties and into the private pages of her journals, they found a sentence that transformed a missing persons case into a haunting enigma. "Something is watching me." What did Amy see in the shadows of the Great Basin? Was her disappearance the result of a calculated predator, a tragic accident, or a darker betrayal closer to home? Join us as we step into the thin mountain air to trace the final footprints of a woman who felt the forest looking back. The Shoshone Shadow. The Shoshone National Forest spans nearly 2.5 million acres of rugged terrain in Wyoming. It is a place of absolute, indifferent beauty, where the wind whistles through lodgepole pines and the granite face of the Wind River Range looms over everything below. For the residents of Lander, a small town nestled at the foot of these mountains, the wilderness was not a place to fear. It was a playground for climbers, hikers, and elite athletes who moved through the high altitude with a sense of belonging. Amy Wroe Bechtel was one of those athletes. She was 24 years old, a competitive runner with a lean, powerful build and a reputation for endurance. On the 24th of July 1997, the weather was clear and the air was thin and crisp, a perfect afternoon for a long-distance run. The Loop Road, a winding mountain pass that climbs into the Shoshone, was where Amy headed that day. She was driving a white Toyota Tercel, a vehicle that would soon become the focal point of a massive forensic search. To any observer, it was a typical day in the life of an active young woman. She had spent the morning teaching a weightlifting class for children and had stopped by a local photo shop to discuss an upcoming move to a new home. There was no sign of distress, no indication that she was looking over her shoulder. But as she drove higher into the mountains, away from the safety of the town and into the deep shadows of the forest, the narrative of her life began to fracture. When Amy failed to return home by nightfall, her husband Steve Bechtel called the authorities. The initial response was a classic search and rescue operation. In a town like Lander, people do not just vanish without a reason. The assumption was an injury, a twisted ankle on a technical trail, or perhaps an encounter with a black bear or a mountain lion. Search teams moved out under the moonlight, their flashlights cutting through the dense timber. They were looking for a runner in yellow shorts and a blue tank top, a bright splash of color against the dark earth. They found the car first. It was parked off the side of Burnt Gulch, an area known for its breathtaking views and treacherous drops. The Toyota was unlocked. The keys were gone, but Amy's wallet and gear were sitting right where she had left them. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, and no blood. It was as if she had simply stepped out of the driver's seat and evaporated into the thin mountain oxygen. As the sun rose the following morning, the scale of the disappearance began to settle into the bones of the community. Over the next several days, the Shoshone National Forest became the site of one of the largest search efforts in Wyoming history. Hundreds of volunteers joined forces with the National Guard and specialized mountain rescue teams. Helicopters, equipped with infrared sensors, circled the peaks, searching for a heat signature in the cooling canyons. Bloodhounds were brought in to catch a scent, but the high-altitude winds and the rocky soil made their work nearly impossible. Every abandoned mine shaft was checked. Every ravine was scouted. The forest was combed with a level of intensity that should have yielded something: a discarded shoe, a hair tie, or a footprint in the mud. Instead, the mountains offered nothing but silence. The mystery deepened when investigators began to look closer at the timeline of the afternoon. Several witnesses reported seeing a white car similar to Amy's, but their accounts were fragmented and sometimes contradictory. Some spoke of a green truck driving erratically in the area. Others mentioned a lone man standing by the road. As the hours turned into days, The hope of a rescue began to sour into the grim reality of a recovery mission. The questions began to outpace the answers. If Amy had been injured, why had the dogs not found her within a mile of the car? If she had been taken, how did someone manage to abduct an elite runner in broad daylight without leaving a single trace of a struggle on the gravel road? The most chilling realization for the searchers was the sheer vastness of the landscape. The Wind River Range is a place where a body can remain hidden for centuries. It is a labyrinth of deadfall and boulders where the earth seems to swallow the echoes of the living. As the official search began to scale back, the investigation turned inward, moving away from the dirt trails and into the personal history of Amy Wroe Bechtel. It was there, hidden in the mundane details of her life, that a darker layer of the story began to emerge. The forest was no longer just a backdrop for a disappearance. It was a witness to a fear that Amy had been carrying with her long before she parked her car at Burnt Gulch. The runner, life before the silence. To understand the tragedy of July 24, one must look at the life Amy Wroe Bechtel was building in the valley below the mountains. She was not a casual jogger or someone unfamiliar with the demands of the Wyoming backcountry. At 24 years old, Amy was a disciplined athlete with aspirations that reached toward the 2000 Summer Olympics. She had been a standout distance runner at the University of Wyoming, a woman whose life was measured in heart rates, split times, and the rhythmic percussion of sneakers on pavement. In the tight-knit community of Lander, she was a familiar face, a person who lived with a quiet, persistent momentum. The summer of 1997 should have been a season of celebration. Just weeks before she vanished, Amy and her husband, Steve Bechtel, had closed on their first home. They were a couple defined by the outdoors, a pairing of a marathon runner and a world-renowned rock climber. They had moved to Lander specifically because the landscape offered a grueling, beautiful training ground. While Steve explored the limestone cliffs, Amy conquered the high-altitude trails. Their life appeared to be a masterclass in stability and shared ambition. Amy had recently paid off her student loans and had just earned her trainer certification, a milestone that allowed her to turn her passion for fitness into a career at the Wind River Fitness Center. The morning of the disappearance was remarkably ordinary. Amy taught a youth weightlifting class at the gym, her energy focused on the children she coached. Witnesses described her as upbeat but busy, a woman with a long list of tasks to complete before the big move into the new house. Her to-do list, later found in her car, was a roadmap of a future that she fully intended to inhabit. She needed to call the phone company, arrange for the gas to be turned on, and buy home insurance. She was also deep in the logistics of organizing a 10K hill climb race scheduled for September. Part of her plan for that afternoon involved scouting the very route where the race would take place. Between the gym and the mountains, Amy stopped at a local photography shop. She was an amateur photographer, and she wanted to inquire about entering a competition. The shop owner noticed that Amy seemed to be in a slight rush, frequently checking her watch as if she were racing against an invisible clock. This detail has lingered in the minds of investigators for decades. Was she simply anxious to get her run finished before the afternoon heat peaked? Or was there an appointment she hadn't told anyone about? When Amy drove her white Toyota Tercel toward the Shoshone National Forest, she left behind a world that was settled and secure. She was a woman who was thriving, a radiant athlete, only 11 days away from her 25th birthday. Friends described her as trusting and even-tempered, someone who moved through the world with a sense of safety that only a small town can provide. In Lander, doors were often left unlocked, and the wilderness was treated as a sanctuary rather than a threat. This background is what makes the silence that followed so deafening. Amy was not a person prone to risky behavior or sudden departures from her routine. She was a woman of habit and precision. As she ascended the loop road, leaving the paved streets of Lander for the gravel and dust of the high country, she was carrying the weight of a promising future. She had every reason to return. The contrast between the vibrant, busy morning and the absolute stillness of the abandoned Tercel, found hours later, creates a void that facts alone cannot fill. The life Amy lived before the silence was one of noise, movement, and light, making her sudden exit into the shadows of the Wind River Range a mystery that defies the very logic she lived by. The journal, "Something is watching me." When a person vanishes in the wilderness, the first instinct of investigators is to look at the terrain. They look for broken branches, disturbed soil, or articles of clothing snagged on thorns. But when the physical search for Amy Wroe Bechtel turned up nothing but the indifferent silence of the Shoshone National Forest, the investigation took a sharp turn into the psychological. Detectives began a meticulous sweep of the home Amy shared with Steve, looking for any clue that might explain her state of mind on that July afternoon. What they found inside her personal journals changed the entire complexion of the case. It moved the narrative from a simple missing persons report into the realm of a chilling, atmospheric thriller. Amy was a diligent chronicler of her life. Her journals were a mix of the mundane and the aspirational, filled with training logs, grocery lists, and reflections on her marriage and her move to Lander. However, as investigators pored over the handwritten pages, a recurring theme began to surface. It was a subtle, creeping sense of unease that seemed to haunt her solo runs in the Wyoming backcountry. In entries written in the months leading up to her disappearance, Amy described a feeling that she was being observed while she was out on the trails. She wrote about the sensation of eyes on her back and the instinctual urge to pick up her pace when the forest felt too quiet. The most haunting phrase discovered in these writings was the specific observation that something is watching me. These 4 words have since become the epitaph of the case, a haunting breadcrumb left behind by a woman who may have sensed her predator before she ever saw them. In the context of a 6,000-word investigative script, this journal entry serves as the pivotal moment where the wilderness stops being a backdrop and starts being a source of active menace. To a runner like Amy, who was intimately familiar with the sounds of the woods, this was not the idle paranoia of a city dweller. It was the documented intuition of an experienced outdoorswoman. Investigators had to ask if Amy was describing a literal person or a figurative shadow. Some experts suggested she might have been sensing the presence of a mountain lion or a bear, predators that are known to stalk their prey for miles before striking. But the tone of her writing suggested something more calculated and more human. She wrote about feeling followed on specific routes, including the very areas near the loop road where her car was eventually found. This raised a terrifying possibility. Had someone been patterning her movements? Had a stalker been watching her from the tree line for weeks, waiting for the moment she stepped far enough away from her vehicle to be vulnerable? The journals also provided a glimpse into the complexities of her private life. While many saw a happy, athletic couple, the pages hinted at the stresses of a young marriage and the pressure of elite competition. There were mentions of arguments and the typical frictions of a life in transition. While these entries did not provide a smoking gun, they forced the police to cast a wider net. They began to wonder if the something watching Amy was a stranger in the woods, or if it was a metaphor for a life that was becoming increasingly claustrophobic. The weight of these writings cannot be overstated. In a case with no body, no DNA, and no witnesses, the journal became the primary piece of evidence. It transformed the search from a rescue mission into a hunt for a shadow. The phrase, "something is watching me," reframed every abandoned truck seen on the highway and every lone hiker encountered on the trail. It suggested that Amy's disappearance was not a random act of nature, but the climax of a story that had been written in her own hand long before she ever reached Burnt Gulch. The journals turned the Shoshone National Forest into a place of active surveillance, where the trees were no longer just timber, but cover for an unknown entity that had finally stepped out of the periphery and into the light. The search, 4,000 square miles of granite. The Shoshone National Forest is not a place that gives up secrets easily. It is a vertical world of loose scree, ancient timber, and granite ridges that seem to stretch into infinity. When the call went out that a woman was missing near Burnt Gulch, The response was immediate and overwhelming. In a state like Wyoming, where the wilderness is a neighbor to every citizen, a missing person is a community crisis. By the time the sun rose on the 25th of July, 1997, the gravel roads leading into the high country were choked with vehicles. This was the beginning of an operation that would eventually encompass a massive search area and involve hundreds of individuals, yet yield a level of physical evidence that was disturbingly close to zero. The logistics of the search were a testament to the urgency of the moment. Over 500 volunteers, ranging from local ranchers to world-class rock climbers from the National Outdoor Leadership School, descended on the mountains. They were joined by the National Guard, the Fremont County Sheriff Department, and specialized mountain rescue teams. The air above the Wind River Range was thick with the sound of rotors as helicopters, equipped with sophisticated thermal imaging sensors, swept the canyons. These machines were looking for a heat signature, a flicker of warmth in the cooling mountain air that might indicate a living person. But the sensors found only the cold, hard radiation of the rocks. On the ground, the searchers faced a landscape that was actively hostile to their efforts. The Wind River Range is characterized by extreme changes in elevation, where a trail can climb 2,000 feet in a matter of miles. This topography creates a labyrinth of hidden pockets. A person could be 20 feet off a trail and remain completely invisible behind a single boulder or within a dense thicket of deadfall. To make matters worse, a sudden afternoon thunderstorm had moved through the area shortly after Amy was last seen. The rain did more than just dampen the ground. It washed away the subtle traces that a tracker might have used to find her. The use of scent dogs provided one of the most frustrating chapters of the entire search. Bloodhounds and cadaver dogs were brought to the white Toyota Tercel at Burnt Gulch. These animals are capable of catching a scent even underwater or through layers of debris, but in the thin, dry air of the Wyoming high country, the dogs struggled. They circled the vehicle, but they could not establish a clear trail leading away from it. This led to a haunting question that has never been answered. If Amy had started her run from that spot, why was there no scent for the dogs to follow? It suggested a terrifying possibility that she may have never set foot on the ground at that location, or that she had been taken into another vehicle before her scent could be established. As the days bled into a week, the search radius expanded to nearly 30 miles. Teams on horseback rode into the most remote drainages, while divers checked the frigid waters of nearby lakes. Every abandoned mineshaft in the region was scouted, and every cave was inspected with flashlights. The sheer scale of the effort was unprecedented for the region, yet the result remained the same. Not a single definitive clue was recovered. No yellow tank top, no blue shorts, and no Adidas running shoes. In the history of Wyoming's search and rescue, it is almost unheard of for such a massive effort to yield absolutely nothing. This lack of evidence began to shift the perspective of the investigators. They began to realize that they were not looking for a woman who had simply taken a wrong turn or suffered a medical emergency. The mountains were too thoroughly combed for a body to remain undiscovered if it were out in the open. The silence of the forest began to feel less like a tragedy of nature and more like the result of a deliberate act. The search for Amy Wroe Bechtel was the moment the community lost its sense of security. It became clear that the vastness of the Wind River Range could be used not just for recreation, but as a perfect shroud for a crime that left no footprints. The inner circle, the husband. When the sprawling search through the Wind River Range failed to produce a single shred of physical evidence, the investigation inevitably turned its gaze toward the center of Amy's world. In any disappearance, the people closest to the victim are the first to be scrutinized, and for the detectives in Lander, that meant looking closely at Steve Bechtel. What followed was a complex shift in the case, moving from a desperate rescue mission into a tense, years-long standoff between law enforcement and a man who maintained his innocence while refusing to play by the rules of the interrogation room. Steve Bechtel was an accomplished rock climber, a man whose life was built on physical strength and the calculated risks of the vertical world. On the day Amy vanished, Steve told investigators he had been miles away from the loop road. He stated that he had spent the afternoon scouting new climbing routes near Dubois, Wyoming, with a friend. This alibi was corroborated by the friend, placing Steve 75 miles north of where Amy's white Toyota Tercel was discovered. To the police, however, an alibi provided by a close associate is often viewed with professional skepticism. They began to look for anything that might bridge the gap between Steve's story and the empty car in the mountains. The tension escalated significantly when investigators executed a search warrant on the couple's home. They were looking for clues to Amy's whereabouts, but what they discovered were Steve's personal journals. Unlike Amy's writings, which reflected a sense of being watched, Steve's notebooks contained much darker imagery. Detectives found undated entries that described violence toward women and even mentioned a desire to eliminate evidence of a body. When confronted with these passages, Steve explained that the writings were not literal. He stated they were song lyrics he had written for his band, a form of creative expression that had nothing to do with his wife or her disappearance. Despite this explanation, the optics for the investigation were devastating. The relationship between Steve and the authorities reached a breaking point over the issue of a polygraph test. Early in the investigation, Steve had expressed a willingness to cooperate, but after consulting with a criminal defense attorney, his stance changed. On the advice of his lawyer, Kent Spence, Steve refused to submit to the lie detector test. His legal team argued that polygraphs were notoriously unreliable and often used as monkey traps to manipulate suspects into making false statements. While this is a common legal strategy, in the court of public opinion and in the eyes of the Fremont County Sheriff's Office, the refusal was seen as a sign of guilt. This lack of cooperation effectively froze the domestic side of the investigation. Without a confession, a body, or physical evidence linking Steve to the loop road that afternoon, the police were at a standstill. They interviewed him again on the 1st of August 1997, using a tactic where they falsely claimed to have evidence proving he had murdered Amy. Steve responded by terminating the interview and cutting off further communication with law enforcement. In 1998, officials stated that while Steve was not a central suspect, they had not been able to clear him because of his silence. The suspicion surrounding Steve Bechtel created a deep rift in the community and within Amy's own family. For years, the case was defined by this internal conflict, with many wondering if the answers were hidden in a house in Lander rather than a forest in the mountains. However, as the decades passed and no evidence surfaced to implicate the husband, a new shadow began to emerge from the criminal history of the region. A convicted killer named Dale Wayne Eaton would eventually force investigators to look away from the inner circle and back toward the predators who roamed the vast, open spaces of the Great Basin. The shadow in the woods, Dale Wayne Eaton. As the investigation into the inner circle stalled, a far more predatory figure began to emerge from the criminal underworld of the American West. This was not a suspect born of domestic tension or local suspicion, but a man whose entire existence was a map of violence and abduction. His name was Dale Wayne Eaton, a man the press would eventually dub the Great Basin Killer. For years, detectives had been forced to look at those closest to Amy, but the discovery of Eaton's crime suggested that the something Amy felt, watching her in the woods, might have been a monster who had been hunting young women across state lines for decades. Dale Wayne Eaton was a drifter and a survivalist with a deep knowledge of the remote high country. His connection to the Amy Wroe Bechtel case did not come to light until years after she vanished, specifically following the 2002 resolution of a different cold case. In 1988, an 18-year-old named Lisa Marie Kimmel had disappeared while driving from Denver to Cody. Her body was eventually found in the North Platte River, but the case remained unsolved until DNA evidence linked Eaton to the crime. When investigators searched Eaton's property in Monetta, Wyoming, they found something truly macabre. Buried deep in the earth was Lisa Marie Kimmel's car, still bearing her distinctive license plate. Eaton had not just killed her, he had kept a trophy of the abduction beneath the very ground he walked on. This discovery sent shockwaves through the Fremont County Sheriff's Office. Moneta was only about 75 miles from Lander, a short distance in the vast geography of Wyoming. More importantly, Eaton's own brother eventually provided a piece of testimony that changed the timeline of the 1997 disappearance. He claimed that Dale had been camping in the area near the Burnt Gulch trailhead around the same time Amy went missing. According to family accounts, Eaton had a history of disappearing into the mountains for weeks at a time, living out of his vehicle and preying on those who wandered too far from the safety of numbers. The profile of Dale Wayne Eaton matched the specific fears Amy had recorded in her journal. He was known to use a green Dodge van, a vehicle that matched descriptions of a suspicious truck seen by witnesses on the Loop Road the day Amy vanished. His MO was that of a stalker. In another incident in 1997, just months after Amy disappeared, Eaton was arrested for a brutal kidnapping in the Red Desert. He had stopped to offer help to a family with a broken-down car, only to pull a gun and attempt to abduct them. This revealed a man who used the isolation of the road as his primary weapon, someone who waited for a moment of vulnerability to strike. Despite these chilling parallels, the connection remains a frustrating series of circumstantial links. Eaton, currently serving life in prison after his death sentence was overturned, has consistently refused to speak about Amy Wroe Bechtel. Investigators have attempted to interview him multiple times, offering deals in exchange for the location of her remains, but he has remained a tomb of silence. There is no DNA linking him to the white Toyota Tercel, and without a body to examine, there is no way to prove his presence at the scene. The theory of the Great Basin killer offers a terrifying alternative to the domestic narrative. It suggests that Amy was not the victim of a personal grudge, but a target of opportunity for a man who viewed the Wyoming wilderness as his personal hunting ground. If Eaton was indeed the one watching Amy from the tree line, it would explain why she felt the urge to run faster and why she ultimately vanished without a trace. In a landscape as vast as the Shoshone, a predator like Eaton could strike and retreat into the shadows before the first search party even reached the mountain. He represents the dark reality of the American West, where the beauty of the landscape is often used to mask the movements of those who live outside the law, the something that was watching. The core of the Amy Wroe Bechtel mystery lies in the synthesis of the seen and the unseen. When we look at the collective evidence, we are left to weigh three distinct possibilities, each with its own terrifying implications. The first is the most grounded and perhaps the most tragic, the accidental encounter. Some investigators have theorized that Amy may have been the victim of a hit and run on the narrow, winding gravel of the Loop Road. In this scenario, a driver accidentally struck the young runner and, in a moment of sheer panic and isolation, chose to hide the evidence rather than call for help. The vastness of the Shoshone National Forest offers 1,000 places to conceal a body, and a panicked motorist with a truck bed could have removed Amy from the scene in a matter of minutes. This would explain the lack of blood or struggle at the car, though it fails to account for the intuition Amy recorded in her diary weeks prior. This brings us to the second possibility, the predator who was already there. When Amy wrote that something was watching her, she was articulating a primal instinct that many solo athletes feel but few have to see realized. If we accept the theory involving Dale Wayne Eaton or a similar drifter, the something becomes a human hunter. In this version of events, Amy was not a random victim of an accident, but a target of a slow, methodical stalking process. A predator like Eaton did not stumble upon his victims. He frequented the remote spaces where they felt most at peace. He understood the rhythm of the trails and the predictable habits of runners. The fact that his own brother placed him in the area suggests that the shadow Amy felt might have been cast by his presence among the pines. It transforms her final run into a gauntlet, where every bend in the road was a potential trap set by someone who had been watching her movements for days. The third and most controversial theory remains the domestic shadow. For those who believe the answer lies with Steve Bechtel, the something watching Amy was not a stranger in the woods, but the changing nature of her own home life. Proponents of this theory point to the dark imagery in Steve's journals and the sightings of a truck similar to his in the mountains. They argue that the stresses of a new house, a new marriage, and the pressure of elite athletics may have reached a boiling point. In this narrative, the journal entry about being watched was a manifestation of her declining sense of security within her marriage. However, this theory must contend with the significant alibi Steve possessed, a corroboration that has never been legally broken. It remains a theory of suspicion rather than substance, a cloud that has hung over the case for nearly 3 decades without ever raining down definitive proof. As we look back at the 4,000 square miles of search area, the lack of results forces us to consider a final, more existential something. The Wind River Range is a landscape of high peaks and sudden, violent weather. There is a possibility that Amy simply succumbed to the environment in a way that left her invisible to searchers. A fall into a hidden crevasse, a misstep into a swift canyon river, or an encounter with a predator of the animal variety. While searchers found no evidence of a bear or mountain lion attack, nature has a way of recycling its own. If Amy had wandered even a few hundred yards off the trail, the dense deadfall of the Shoshone could have acted as a natural tomb. In this scenario, the something watching her was the mountain itself, a witness that never speaks and never forgets. The tragedy of the Amy Wroe Bechtel case is that all of these theories are equally haunting, because none of them can be proven. We are left with a collection of fragmented artifacts, a white Toyota, a pair of Adidas sneakers that never came home, and a journal entry that serves as a warning from the past. The forest remains exactly as it was in July 1997, a place of silent, looming granite and whispering pines. Whether Amy was taken by a man, a husband, or the mountains themselves, she remains a part of the Wyoming landscape, a permanent resident of the high country who sensed the end before it arrived. The mystery is not just about where she went, but about the terrifying clarity of her final written thoughts. She knew she was not alone, and in the end, the silence of the forest suggests she was right. A cold trail in the high country. The high summer of 1997 has long since faded into the collective memory of Wyoming. Yet the silence of the Wind River Range remains as heavy as ever. In 2004, 7 years after Amy Wroe Bechtel vanished from the Loop Road, a legal formality officially severed her from the world of the living. At the request of her husband, Steve, Amy was declared dead in absentia. It was a necessary legal step for those left behind to move forward, yet for the community of Lander, and for the detectives who still keep her file on their desks, the word dead feels like an incomplete sentence. Without a body, without a location, and without an answer, the case remains a hollow space in the heart of the Shoshone National Forest. Today, the landscape Amy loved has changed in subtle, psychological ways. For decades, the residents of Fremont County treated the mountains as a sanctuary where the only dangers were the weather and the wildlife. The disappearance of an elite runner in broad daylight shattered that illusion of safety. It introduced a new kind of vigilance to the Wyoming backcountry, a lingering awareness that the vastness of the land can be used to hide the darkest of human intentions. The trails are still there, and runners still climb the switchbacks of the Shoshone, but many now do so with a heightened sense of their surroundings, perhaps remembering the words of a woman who felt the forest looking back at her. The investigation has never truly closed, though it has moved into a long, quiet phase of waiting. Tips still trickle in, often centered on the same familiar names. As recently as late 2025, renewed interest surfaced regarding properties once connected to Dale Wayne Eaton. There are those who believe that a definitive piece of evidence, a weathered piece of jewelry, or a fragment of bone is still out there, buried beneath a layer of pine needles or tucked inside a long-forgotten cabin. Investigators have not given up on the possibility of a breakthrough, but as the decades pass, the trail grows colder and the forest grows deeper. Steve Bechtel eventually moved on, remarrying and continuing his life in the climbing community, though he remains a figure of intense scrutiny for many who follow the case. Dale Wayne Eaton sits in prison, a silent vault of potential secrets, refusing to offer any closure to the families of the missing. In the absence of a confession or a discovery, we are left with the image of Amy as she was in her final hours, a vibrant, determined athlete running toward a future that was never allowed to arrive. The story of Amy Wroe Bechtel is a reminder of the fragility of the human presence in the wilderness. It is a story about the thin line between peace and peril, and the intuition we often ignore until it is too late. The mountains do not offer apologies, and they do not provide explanations. They simply exist, standing as stone monuments to the mysteries they hold. As the sun sets over the Wind River Range, the shadows stretch across the loop road, and the silence returns to the place where Amy was last seen. We are left only with the wind, the granite, and the lingering, unanswered question of what really happened on that July afternoon. Could a high-profile athlete like Amy truly leave no trace behind in the forest? Or have we simply been looking in the wrong direction for nearly 30 years? In a case with no physical evidence, where do you think the line between coincidence and culpability lies for those she left behind?